The auction hall in Cedar Bluff went so quiet you could hear the wood stove tick in the corner, and the man at the front, with a pressed collar and the ledger under his arm, was smiling the way a man smiles when he has already spent money he does not yet have. He had come to buy her out. He had come with a number written down and a pen already uncapped, so certain of the ending that he had told two other men to wait outside with a truck. And across the room, on a folding chair, with her hands folded in her lap, sat a woman named Odessa Hartline, 41 years old, in a coat that had been mended at both elbows. And she was not smiling, and she was not frowning. She was simply still. The way water is still before you learn how deep it is. Between them, on a low table where everyone could see it, sat a small stool. Just a stool, dark as coffee, banded in soft grain, with a seat that seemed to hold light instead of reflecting it. And the man with the ledger kept glancing at that stool the way you glance at a debt. We'll get back to that room, to that number, to the thing that man was about to say out loud that he should never have known. But by the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? 4 years before that quiet auction hall, this same town had decided, more or less unanimously, that Odessa Hartline had lost her mind. Because 4 years earlier, on a raw morning in late October, 600 charred whiskey barrels had come rolling off a flatbed convoy and been dumped in the low field behind her farmhouse, and she had paid for the privilege. The distillery was called Marrow and Kell, and it sat 11 miles up the river valley, a great brick complex with a copper roof that the whole county was proud of, the way you were proud of a rich cousin. When Marrow and Kell retired a run of barrels, they did not want them back. A charred oak barrel that has held bourbon for a decade is, to a distillery, a spent thing. The char inside is spent. The staves are stained black and sticky with old sugar. They had been trucking their dead barrels to a landfill 2 counties over and paying by the ton to be rid of them. And a man named Sheldon Prager, who managed the distillery's holdings and sat on the county board besides, had grown tired of paying to throw things away. So Prager put out word that anyone who hauled off the retired barrels could have them for a token. And when nobody came, because nobody in Cedar Bluff wanted 600 sticky, ruined barrels, he was prepared to eat the landfill fee one more time. Then Odessa Hartline drove her dead husband's flatbed into the distillery yard and offered him $30 for the lot. 600 barrels, $30, 5 cents a barrel. And Prager laughed so hard he had to lean on his own fence. He took her $30 because it amused him to, and because it saved him the landfill haul, and he told the men in the yard that the widow Hartline had bought herself a mountain of garbage for the price of a sandwich, and by the time the barrels were stacked in her field, the whole town had heard it. A woman alone on a failing farm, spending her last flat money on trash. They said it with pity, which is the meanest thing a town can offer, because pity lets a person feel kind while they laugh. Odessa had been alone for 2 years by then. Her husband, Wade, had run the dairy that his father had run before him, and when Wade's heart gave out in the milking parlor one grey February morning, the cows went to auction inside of a month because Odessa could not run the herd and pay the loan against it both. What was left to her was the house. 40 acres of tired pasture, a barn with a leaking roof, Wade's flatbed truck, and a silence so large it had its own weather. The town waited for her to sell up and move to her sisters in the city. That was the arithmetic they had done for her. 1 woman, 40 acres, no herd. The answer was leave. But Odessa did not do arithmetic the way the town did. Before she married Wade, she had worked 6 years in a cabinet shop, 3 towns over, sanding and joining and finishing, learning the grain of a board, the way some people learn scripture, and she had a gift her employer had called uncanny and her father had called useless, which was that she could look at a rough, ugly piece of wood and see the finished thing hiding inside it. She had given that up for the dairy, because a marriage is also a kind of arithmetic, and now the dairy was gone, and the gift was all she had left, sitting quiet under the years like a coal under ash. So when she heard that Marrow and Kell was throwing away oak, she did not see 600 ruined barrels. She saw 600 barrels of white oak, quarter-sawn and tight-grained, seasoned 10 and 15 years, cured through and through with bourbon and fire. She saw a lumber yard nobody knew was a lumber yard. She saw it so clearly it frightened her. Her nearest neighbor was an old man named Thomas V. Ware, who had come to this valley from a country he only ever named as over the water, and who had kept to himself so thoroughly for 30 years that half the town had forgotten his first name. He grew apples on a slope that everyone said was too steep and too rocky for apples, and every autumn his crooked trees hung so heavy the branches had to be propped. The day the barrels came, Thomas walked the fence line and looked at the black mountain of them a long time, and then he looked at Odessa and he said, in his slow, careful way, that the tree does not choose the axe, but the wood remembers the sun it drank. She did not fully understand him that day. She wrote it down anyway, on the back of a feed receipt, and pinned it above her workbench, because some sentences you keep until you grow into them. The other one who came was a child. His name was Pruitt, and he was 9 that first autumn, a narrow, watchful boy, from the rented house at the crossroads where his mother worked 2 shifts, and his father was a roomer. Pruitt had a habit of appearing at the edges of other people's work, saying nothing, missing nothing. He appeared at Odessa's fence the second day and asked her what she was going to do with all that. And Odessa, who had told no one the true answer, found herself telling him, because he was 9 and would not laugh. She told him she was going to take them apart and build things. Pruitt considered this and then climbed over the fence and started stacking hoop bands into a pile without being asked. And that was the beginning of the only partnership she would have for a long time. That first winter was the taking apart. Every barrel had to be broken down by hand, and if you have never done it, understand that a whiskey barrel is built to survive being dropped, rolled, and stacked wet for decades, so it does not want to come apart. Odessa knocked the iron hoops loose, one at a time, and the staves fell like the ribs of some great animal. 31 or 32 of them to a barrel, and every stave had to be scraped of its char, its inner face black and blistered like burnt toast. Beneath the black the wood came up, the colour of dark honey, where the whiskey had soaked and stained it years deep. Her hands cracked and bled at the knuckles all through December. She sorted the staves into 3 piles, the way she sorted everything, the good, the checked, and the ruined. And she was strict as a judge about which was which, because she knew a chair that fails under a person is worse than no chair at all. Of the first 100 barrels she broke down, she kept, perhaps, 6 staves in 10. The rest went to the wood stove, and all that winter her house smelled of oak and old bourbon and the faint sweetness of caramelized wood, so that even the ash in her stove smelled expensive. She kept a ledger. Every farmer's wife keeps a ledger, but Odessa's was a strange one, because it did not track cows or milk or feed. It tracked the arithmetic she was living inside. $30 for the barrels, $61 for a set of good chisels she bought used from a retiring carpenter, the cost of glue, the cost of oil, the cost of the blades she wore out. Against that column she could put nothing yet, no income at all, only the growing stacks of clean, honeyed staves drying in the barn. Under the leaking roof she had patched herself with tar and a borrowed ladder. Every night she looked at that ledger and did the hard arithmetic. The town did the arithmetic of a widow burning her savings. Odessa did the arithmetic of survival, which is a different kind of math entirely, because it counts not what a thing costs today, but what it might become. Sheldon Prager came to see her in the spring. He drove up in a clean truck and stood in her yard with his hands in his pockets and looked at the barn full of drying oak with an expression she could not quite read. And he told her warmly that he hated to see her working herself to death out here. He said the county could use her 40 acres for a drainage easement, and he was in a position to make her an offer that would let her go to her sister in comfort. He named a number. It was a low number dressed up as a kindness. The way his whole visit was low, dressed up as kindness. Odessa thanked him for coming and did not say yes and did not say no. She just let the silence sit there in the yard until Prager got back in his truck. He said, driving off, that she'd come around when the money ran out. It was the first time he had underestimated her out loud. It would not be the last. By the second autumn, she had built the first pieces that were truly good, not the practice stools that wobbled, not the first table whose top cupped in the dry heat and had to be burned. Good ones. She had learned that the bourbon staves needed no stain at all, that the years of whiskey and the years of fire had already colored the oak deeper than any dye she could buy, so that a finished chair glowed with a color that no store could sell because no store knew how to make it. She had learned to leave the faint, blistered texture of the char in a hidden place on each piece, the underside of a seat, the inner curve of an armrest, a black signature that said this wood had been through fire. Thomas came and ran his old hands over a finished chair for a long time, feeling the joints, and he said, the thing again, that the wood remembers the sun it drank. And this time she understood it. The barrels had not been ruined by their years inside the distillery. They had been made. The stain that spoiled them for whiskey was the very thing that made them beautiful as furniture. The wound was where the sweetness had entered. She sold nothing in town. This was deliberate. She loaded 4 chairs and a small table into Wade's flatbed and drove 3 hours to a city market where nobody knew her and nobody pitied her, and she set her pieces out among the other makers. And by noon, a woman who furnished restaurants for a living had bought all 4 chairs and the table and asked, breathless, how soon Odessa could make 40 more. Odessa drove home with more money in an envelope than the dairy had cleared in a good month, and she told no one. She banked it low and quiet, the way Tomas banked his apples in the cool of his cellar. She had learned the town's own lesson better than the town had. It is easier for people to believe a thing is worthless than to admit they were fools, to laugh at it. And if she came home boasting, they would only find a new way to say she was lucky or crazy or worse. So she let them keep pitying her. Pity, she had discovered, is a wonderful place to hide. Pruitt was 11 now and had grown into the work like a graft takes to a rootstock. He had a genius for the finishing, the patient oiling and buffing that most people rushed, and he had named the pieces because Odessa never bothered to. He called the round 3-legged stool the toadstool. He called the long dining table the river, because of the way the grain ran down its length like current. When the restaurant buyer wanted 40 chairs, it was Pruitt who worked out on the barn wall, in chalk, exactly how many good staves 40 chairs would eat and how many barrels they would have to break down to get them, and his arithmetic was correct to the stave. He believed in the work with a completeness that Odessa, who was older and had been laughed at, could not always manage on the dark nights. On the dark nights, she borrowed his belief. That is what a child is for. Sometimes in a house that has lost too much, the orders came steadily and then quickly. The restaurant buyer told a designer, the designer told a shop in the city, and the shop put one of Odessa's river tables in its front window with a small card that said the oak had lived 15 years inside a bourbon barrel, and something about that card made people want the table badly. She raised her prices twice, and the orders did not slow, they grew. By the end of the 3rd year, the envelope had become a proper account at the bank in Cedar Bluff, and the arithmetic in her strange ledger had finally, quietly, crossed over from red into black, and kept climbing. She patched the whole barn roof properly. She bought a second set of chisels so she would not have to sharpen between every cut. But she still drove to the city to sell, still let the town believe she was scraping by, still said, when anyone asked, only that she was getting on. The coal stayed banked under the ash, glowing, waiting. The bank was where the trouble started, because a small-town bank is a small town's biggest gossip, and Sheldon Prager sat on the board of it the way he sat on every board that mattered. He could not see her account balances, not exactly. That would have been a crime. But he saw the deposits going in, saw a widow he had written off as broke, bringing in envelopes month after month, and it ate at him. He came to her yard a second time and a third. Each time the number he offered was a little higher and a little more impatient, and each time it was still an insult dressed as a rescue, because Prager had decided long ago what her 40 acres and her barn full of what he still thought was junk were worth. And he could not update that figure any more than he could update his opinion of her. She refused him every time with the same level courtesy. The refusing seemed to unsettle him more than any argument could have. A man like Prager knew how to win a fight. He did not know what to do with a woman who simply would not fight him at all. Then the reckoning came, the way reckonings do, from a direction no one was watching. It began at the distillery. Marrow and Kell, in its pride, had contracted to supply a huge run of aged barrels to a bottler downstate, and to fill the contract they had leaned hard on new oak, ordering fresh barrels by the thousand from a cooperage upriver. But there is a fungus that lives in oak, a rot that can hide in wood that was dried too fast, and the cooperage upriver had rushed its drying to meet the distillery's rushed order, and the rot came into the valley inside those thousands of shiny new barrels like an army inside a gift. Within a season, the distillery discovered that its new barrels were failing, weeping, souring the spirit inside them, and the failure spread warehouse to warehouse faster than they could pull the barrels off the racks. It was in the newspapers within the month. Marrow and Kell, the county's rich cousin, the copper roof, and the brick and the pride of Cedar Bluff, had 100,000 gallons of ruined bourbon and a debt to a downstate bottler it could not pay. And here is where the whole valley tilted on its axis. Everyone who had land or money tied to that distillery began to sink. Prager had leveraged the distillery's holdings against loans that could not be paid, and the county board, which had let him do it, began to panic. Meanwhile, the seasoned oak that everyone had thrown away, the old bourbon barrels that Marrow and Kell had once paid to bury in a landfill, became suddenly wildly valuable. Because the story of the rot in the new oak was in every paper, and buyers and makers up and down the region wanted only the old, proven, seasoned stuff now, and there was exactly one person in the county who had a barn full of it, broken down and dried and sorted into good and checked and ruined. The town did not know quite how to look at Odessa Hotline anymore. First, the mockery went silent, which was its own kind of loud. Then came suspicion, the way it always does. A woman alone who buys garbage for $30 and grows rich on it while the mighty distillery falls. There were those in Cedar Bluff who murmured that it was not natural, that she must have known something, that there was something almost witchy about a widow who could turn ruined wood into gold. Odessa heard the murmurs the way she heard everything, quietly, and she said nothing, and the silence unsettled them more than any denial could have. Then, slowly, grudgingly, the suspicion curdled into respect, because respect is what mockery becomes when it finally runs out of other options. Men who had laughed at her in the auction yard 4 years earlier now tipped their hats at the feed store. She tipped hers back. She did not gloat. Gloating, she knew, was just another way of still caring what they thought. Sheldon Prager, drowning, made his last calculation, and it was the worst one of his life. Marrow and Kell had one asset that might yet save it, the sudden gold rush in seasoned barrels, and the largest supply of them anywhere in reach sat in Odessa Hartline's barn. If Prager could get that oak, if he could get her whole operation, the barn, the stock, the name that was now in city shop windows, he might refinance the distillery's debt against it and land on his feet. So he did not come to her yard this time. He came at her through the auction hall, publicly, cleverly, or so he thought. He arranged, with the county board's blessing, a public sale of a delinquent agricultural note, and he had done just enough legal maneuvering to make it appear that Odessa's farm was tangled up in it, that she owed against the drainage easement she had never signed. And he stood in that quiet hall in Cedar Bluff, with his pressed collar and his ledger, prepared to buy her out from under herself in front of the whole town for a fraction of what she was worth. He had a number written down. He had 2 men and a truck waiting outside. He was so certain of the ending that he had already, in his mind, spent it. And that is where we began. The stove ticking, the little stool on the table, the toadstool Pruitt had named, dark as coffee and holding the light. Odessa on the folding chair, with her mended coat and her folded hands, still as deep water. The auctioneer, uneasy, read out the note and the claim, and there was that legal wrinkle Prager had manufactured, the alleged debt against the easement, and Prager rose to make his offer to settle it and take title to the farm. But before the auctioneer could ask for competing bids, Odessa's lawyer, a plain young woman from the city that the buyer's designer had recommended, stood and laid a single folder on the table, and in it was proof, plain as daylight, that Odessa had never signed any easement, that no lien existed, that the note Prager had dressed the farm into had nothing to do with her land at all. The manufactured debt evaporated in the space of a sentence. The room understood, slowly, that Sheldon Prager had tried to steal a woman's farm in public and been caught with the folder open. But it was what Prager said next that undid him, because pride, when it is falling, always reaches for the one branch that breaks. He was flustered, and he tried to turn the room, and he pointed at the little stool on the table, and he said to the crowd, with a sneer he could not keep out of his voice, that they were all being taken in, that this so-called business was smoke, that she did not even have the stock to fill her orders, that she had, and here he named it, 340 barrels left in that barn, and not one more. So how could she possibly be worth what the city fools claimed? The hall went very quiet, because Odessa Hartline had told no one how many barrels remained. It was not in any public record. It was not in the bank's papers. There was exactly one place that number lived, in the chalk arithmetic on the inside wall of her barn, where Pruitt worked out the stock 340, and the only way a man could know that number was if he had been inside her barn without her leave, counting what he meant to take. Prager had gone out there in the dark more than once, the way he'd gone to the bank, the way he did everything, measuring what belonged to other people. So he could tell himself it was already his. And in his panic he had said the number out loud in a room full of witnesses, and every soul in that hall did the arithmetic at the same instant and arrived at the same answer. He had been trespassing. He had been planning this theft for months. He had counted her wood in the dark like a man counting a body he intends to rob. Odessa stood up. She did not raise her voice. She had never in 4 years raised her voice at this man, and she did not begin now. She said only that the number was 341, that he had miscounted, and that the miscount was interesting because she had never given anyone leave to count at all, and then she let the silence do the rest. It sat on Prager like snow on a roof, heavier and heavier, until you could see the man understand that he had confessed. There is a kind of quiet that is louder than any accusation, and Odessa had spent 4 years learning to use it, while he had spent 4 years underestimating it. The auctioneer closed the false note. The county board members in the room found somewhere else to look, and Sheldon Prager, who had come to buy her out with a number in his pocket, stood in the middle of a town that had watched him for 30 years and had, in the space of 10 minutes, finally seen him whole. Now here is the part the town tells and retells, the part that turned the story from a scandal into something closer to a legend because of what Odessa did instead of what she had every right to do. She had him. Everyone understood that. The distillery was failing, Prager was exposed as a trespasser and a schemer, and Odessa held the one asset in the county that could turn a profit in the wreckage. She could have let Marrow and Kell sink. She could have watched the copper roof go to the bank and bought the whole complex for pennies when it did, the way he had once tried to buy her for pennies. That would have been the arithmetic of greed. And she had watched greed do its arithmetic for 4 years, and she knew exactly where it ended, in a quiet hall with a man confessing his own crime out of pride. Instead, she asked to speak, and she spoke to the whole room, not to Prager. Not, she said, the distillery was the largest employer in the valley. That better than 200 families ate because of that copper roof, and that if it went down, every one of them went down with it. And none of those families had ever laughed at her. They had only been afraid, and fear is not a crime. She said she had 600 barrels of ruined bourbon oak in her memory, and she had learned that ruined was only a word people used when they were too proud to look closer. Then she made her offer, aloud in front of everyone, and it was the offer that bound the valley together for a generation. She would not sell her farm. She would instead buy at fair market and not a penny less to shame anyone, the distillery's entire stock of retired seasoned barrels, all of them, going forward at a real price, a price that would help Marrow and Kell make its payments to the downstate bottler and keep its doors open. In exchange, she would take a lease on the empty warehouse the distillery no longer needed, and she would move her furniture works into it, and she would hire, and she named the number so no one could mistake it, at least 30 people in the first year, the men and women of Cedar Bluff who had land and money tied to that distillery and nowhere to turn. The old rot in the new oak had nearly killed the valley. The old proven oak that the valley had thrown away would now save it, and she would pay Marrow and Kell for their retired barrels going forward a fair, honest price. Not $30 for 600, a fair price. Because she remembered what $30 for 600 had felt like on the receiving end, and she had decided long ago that when her turn came, she would not do to anyone what had been done to her. Sheldon Prager was not part of the arrangement. The county board saw to that quietly in the weeks after, the way a body sheds a splinter, but the distillery lived. The furniture, works, filled the empty warehouse with the sound of chisels and the smell of oak and old bourbon and caramelized wood, and the town that had once pitied her now applied for jobs at her door. Thomas V. Ware came to see the warehouse the week it opened. He was very old by then, older than the story could account for, and he walked the long rows of drying staves with his hands clasped behind his back, and he stopped in front of the great river table that stood in the entry like a boast Odessa would never make in words. He ran his hand down the current of the grain. He said the thing one more time, that the wood remembers the sun it drank, and then he added something he had never said before, that a person is only wood too, and the years that stain us dark are the same years that make us worth the keeping. Odessa wrote that down as well, on the back of an invoice this time, and pinned it above her new workbench next to the old feed receipt. 2 sentences, 4 years apart from the same old man, and between them the whole shape of her life. Pruitt was 14 when the warehouse opened. He is the foreman there now, though that is another story, a long way past the edge of this one. Odessa took him in when his mother left the valley to chase work. She never found, and she raised him the rest of the way in the house that had once held only silence and its own weather, and the silence at last had other sounds in it. On the wall of the warehouse office she keeps her strange ledger still, the one that tracks the arithmetic she has always lived inside, and if you look at the very first page you will find, in a hand that shook a little the day she wrote it. One line. Trail. $30. 600 barrels. And under it, added years later in steadier ink, 3 words that are not a sum, but a beginning, worth the keeping. She had been, for a while, one woman alone on 40 tired acres, and the whole town had done the arithmetic and gotten the answer wrong because they had counted what she cost and never once what she might become. It is the easiest mistake in the world. It is easier to believe a thing is ruined than to admit you were a fool to laugh at it. And it is easier to call a person alone than to see that alone was only ever the first word of the sentence, and that the rest of it, the part that took 4 winters and 600 barrels and a boy who named the stools and an old man from over the water, the rest of it reads quietly and true, that no one who can look at a burnt and broken thing and see the sun still sleeping inside it is ever really alone for long.